Welcome back to Daddyless Daughters Podcast in partnership with Solace Womens Aid. I go by the name of Aliyah Ali, and today I'm joined by the beautiful Dominy Rowe. How are you today, honey?
I'm great after spending some time with you.
Thank you for being here today. I really appreciate you, and I'm really looking forward to this conversation. I love the energy that we have when we kind of get into these type of talks. As you lot know, the concept is dirty water, us exploring the patterns that, we saw in the household and how that impacted our understanding of what a healthy relationship is. So my first question for you today is, I guess, at what age did you realise you was a daddyless daughter?
I think I've had lots of points of realisation, like at different stages. I believe in new beginnings on a regular basis, right? And I suppose the first point would have been in my earlier, teenage years, but I didn't actually realise, that the kind of the craving and the inappropriate ways that I would try and get attention from men was linked to being a daddyless daughter. And actually I would say it was probably when I was 31 that I actually started to, in therapy, explore not having a dad or not having a dad present in my life and what that had meant. And actually, instead of having a dad, having lots of abusive stepdads. And so that, the role that that men had played in my life and how that then had impacted both my, I guess, perception of men, but also experience of men, like how I'd experienced them and attracted a certain kind of man and so on. And then only in the last couple of years, my birth dad has actually got in touch with me, and that's brought a whole nother level of understanding of being a daddyless daughter. I think some resentment that came up, some anger, you think you've forgiven these things, and then you're presented with the reality of it and having some of the conversations and feelings around, actually, if you'd have been there at certain points and there'd been some protection or some protective factors that you would have been able to provide, then my life could have looked very differently. And some of the resentment, I guess, that came up because of that. And I remember a really powerful exploration around what it would mean to have had a dad in therapy. And I remember talking about how, for me, I often find Sunday afternoons quite triggering. I guess that's a point where lots of friends would have family time or have like a Sunday dinner together.
Yeah.
And I remember my therapist gave me a homework task to go away and kind of describe what I would like that Sunday afternoon to look like if I had a dad. And I think also through my faith, through coming to understand God and a father in a spiritual sense, and then some of the barriers that I had to that because I hadn't experienced an earthly father in a positive way.
Yeah, and I think the way you explained it or articulated it is perfect because it's layered.
So layered.
It's so layered, and I think as well, it's like stages of grief as well, and it's like grieving a man who's still alive sometimes. Well, some of us don't have dads that are still alive, but just those stages of grief, and I feel like you articulated that perfectly. Give us a bit more context in terms of your background. How did you grow up?
So I've come to learn that my birth dad, had left when I was about 6 months old. I was the first. My mum had 5 girls, 4 different men, but my mum and my dad had lived in a bedsit when I was born, and my mum ended up going with the guy in the bedsit below, in the bedroom below, and moving in with him 6 months after I was born. And that was, I guess, the start. And this is stuff I've come to learn later on in life and through having conversations with my birth dad. I've been estranged from my mum now since I was about 17. So she'd had a nervous breakdown when I was 12 years old, and I was the eldest of the 5 of us. And she'd left, and I'd gone to various placements, care, etc. But prior to that, there'd been a lot of violence, substance misuse, mental health. My mum had really struggled with her mental health whilst we were growing up. And so I think even now, as you know, I'm 36 years old, I'm still dealing with and exploring some of those nuances and incidents that had occurred whilst I was growing up and what that looked like. And obviously being the eldest of 5 girls, and some of my sisters really struggle now with their mental health and because of some of the stuff that they witnessed and experienced. But yeah, and there was sexual abuse from one of my stepdads who was 2 of my sister's birth dads.
Wow.
If that makes sense. So yeah.
That must have been very conflicting. How did you deal with that?
I mean, I didn't deal with any of it until, like I said, until I went into therapy. And really, I'd always known that there was this box that at some point in my life I would need to explore. And I remember the first therapy session I had, she asked me, why have you waited so long? And in all honesty, and I broke down in tears and I said, I was so worried I would have a nervous breakdown. And that was the route that my mum had taken in terms of, you know, her mental health. And I guess I always did. I was really scared that, like, as soon as I went into this stuff, that I wouldn't be able to cope with life anymore. And that hasn't been the case. And in fact, it's been the opposite. You know, that I've found more and more strength as I've started to delve into this. But I remember I remember telling one of my sisters that it was her dad that had sexually abused me. And then the guilt and shame that she then felt because of that, you know, and he wasn't somebody that she'd kept around in her life because he'd been so abusive to her as well. And there were drugs involved and he had addictions and mental health issues as well. But I think that's still something we work through in our existing relationship. You know, it's not always something that we actively talk about, but there may be points where we'll mention something and have that deeper level conversation.
Yeah.
And that's layered as well, because it's the difference between maintaining a healthy relationship with my sister now versus exploring some of that really unhealthy stuff that happened to us when we were younger. And she was much younger at the time, this one particular sister. And I have different levels of relationships with my siblings, with all of them.
When you was younger and you was experiencing that, did you ever think that your other sisters were being sexually abused as well? Or was it a very isolated experience?
I didn't ever think about it as abuse. And I think that's been a quite a severe realization as an adult, because when you grow up in that environment, it is so normal. And it's only when I got to sort of the age of maybe about 12, 13, maybe slightly younger, started going to friends' houses, you know, and the level of food that we would get, or the level of attention or emotional engagement. And it always felt so safe and so peaceful. But even then, I didn't make the I guess I wasn't aware that, like, my home was like that and theirs was like this, and that was the difference. Yeah, and so I didn't articulate it as abuse for a very long time. And I carried so much shame about what had happened and that version of Dominy that I had tried so hard to get away from in my 20s. And I did get away from it in many ways. You know, I became very successful in my career. I had great, thriving friendships, but it was in the area of my romantic relationships that were extremely unhealthy and eventually reached a point of a bit of a mini breakdown for me. And I realised I'm the common denominator in these very unhealthy cycles with men. And started to want to take some responsibility for that. So in that, then started to look at that past stuff. And really, actually, it was from the age of 30 onwards that I started to understand the impact of my childhood. You know, and I still am shocked now. Like, how did I work in the field of young people and social care for more than 10 years prior to realising just how influential our early childhood experiences are on our adult life?
You said so many things there. First, I want to touch on, like, the importance of, like, girls that do grow up in these households, not just girls as well, guys that have been sexually abused. And it's not only until you do reach that age of like, it's that age that I've noticed is between 12 and 14 when you go out into school or the community, and then you actually start to have conversations about sex, or your friends start to talk about sex, and people start, you know, showing you, boys or whatever start showing you porn or whatever. And then you realize, hold on, I've already experienced certain things. And then that's kind of the wave of shame, judgment, and then those are also the ages where we start to act out as well, because we come to certain realizations. We don't know how to actually deal with them. Like you're saying, it's like layered things that we keep putting in Pandora's box, and it all lays on top, on top, on top, and then it comes out in different ways in our behavior during those adolescent years. During your adolescent years, how did all of that play out in your behavior, your attitude? How did you start to see the world?
I'd lived quite independently. From the age of about 10 years old, I was out until 4 a.m. in the morning, you know, smoking bongs. I'd grown up, where I was at that point in time was in a seaside town, and it was hash and bongs. And I look back now and remember being in what we would say sort of that crack house, you know, when I was 10, 11 years old. I was having sexual encounters with much older men from that age as well. And my first sexual, you know, full-on experience was I was 12 years old. And again, there's a lot of grief around that. There's a lot of processing around that. And because I didn't understand what that was at all. And it at the time felt like love, or felt like, you know, some kind of attention or positive affirmation, or, you know, the complete opposite of what it actually was. But they were my first experiences, and yeah, with much older men and lots of substances and unhealthy factors involved. And then I went through, I'd say, the majority of my teenage years acting out both, you know, very unhealthy relationships with men, and it would be the men who were a bit older, the local drug dealers who drove cars illegally and all of that stuff. And I guess my saving grace in some ways was that I was always quite academically bright. And so I did quite well at school, even though I was regarded as the naughty one, and I would often get the detentions and the exclusions and so on. I was always identified as someone that had potential. And so there was support put in place at times, and interventions. And I remember a really significant intervention, which was being sent away on a trip for about 4 days to Bath Spa University. And it was part of a project at the time called Aim Higher. And it identified students that were not fulfilling their potential, basically, but had the potential to be able to achieve 5 GCSEs or whatever it was back then. And that was so instrumental for me, because I experienced like quite cool, slightly older adults that were like, success was cool. Do you know what I mean? Because up until that point, being naughty and being irreverent and smoking and breaking the rules and sleeping with boys and whatever, that was cool.
Yeah.
Like that had, do you know what I mean? That had given me kudos and status, and I was one of the cool girls or in that gang or whatever. But actually, on that experience, I guess I began to see that ambition and drive and success in a different way.
And see yourself in a different way.
Absolutely, and feel it. Like sitting in a lecture room and, you know, a lecture theatre, because that's what we got to do for the 4 days. It was like a really immersive experience of university, and no one had, and I'd never thought that could be something I could have done. And so then getting to university became a real primary goal for me. Like I wanted to do something that no one else had done in my family and that I could be proud of, you know. And I was quite ambitious from a younger age. Like I remember watching Ally McBeal and wanting to be a lawyer and then wanting to be a journalist and, you know, kind of having these career aspirations and wanting to go to uni because that would be something that made me feel good or looked good, you know, as in terms of my identity. But again, I was building an identity which was all external. It was these external success factors which were, I guess, driving further and further away from the real me, the little Dom inside of me, the authentic version of me. And instead I was piling on these external layers of affirmation and validation that then in the last 6-7 years in therapy and coaching and various other programs that I've started to really have to strip back and get to understand who I really am and what my values are and what I like, you know, not just what I like because that's cool and everyone else likes that and will like me if I like that.
I think it's important to highlight that because I think all of us within those age, like the adolescent times of our lives, start to build up a sense of self-worth in different ways. And like you said, at first it starts off, you know, especially if you're a street girl and your life, you know, you end up on the street at a very young age, we start to build up our self-esteem and self-worth with all these guys in the crime or whatever.
And I was laughing with someone the other day, like, do you remember when spitting was cool? Like, like, do you remember when, like, the coolest thing you could do was, like, do a double spit or smoke in a certain way or whatever? And, like, it's crazy, isn't it? That, like, that was what we were aspiring to from a really young age and throughout such formative years, like those adolescent years, which are so formative on so much of our future life. And all the risk-taking behaviours which I displayed as a result of not having had the security, safety, affirmation at home, you know?
Yeah. What emotions could you identify with at that age?
Oh, that's such a good question. That always gets me as well because I actually tend to, at the moment, use a feelings wheel or a list of emotions because I really have always struggled to put a name to a feeling or to really understand what it is that I'm feeling. I think when I look back, the shame, the abandonment, the rejection, feelings of aloneness, I often have this image in therapy sessions when I talk about things that feel hard or when I'm triggered, what it feels like. And it's of a little girl me in a deep, dark well, and I can see this light at the top, but there's no way of getting to that light. Like it's that hopelessness and that feeling of desperation that comes in those moments. And I would say those are the feelings that I attribute to my little Dom, you know, and I've had to really work hard on that inner child, that reparenting, that learning to love little Dom inside of me. And like we were talking about it before, but the survival traits that we've put in place, which have enabled us to survive, you know, the being super independent and driven and ambitious. But actually, you reach a certain age and some of those can be real intimacy blockers. And I've learned that I have a lot of masculine traits and I'm, you know, trying to learn to walk more in my femininity and find more joy and peace and freedom and exploring what that looks like for me. But yeah, that little girl inside of me, she's still there and she still can be very easily triggered. You know, the feelings of rejection and abandonment are so raw still.
Yeah.
And we talked about this, you know, do you ever really fully get away from that stuff? I mean, I have a lot of strategies now that I implement and tools and things that I use on a daily basis. That doesn't mean that those feelings feel any less raw. You know, and sometimes in therapy sessions now, my therapist will like validate me in some way. Like she'll say something like, you know, I think you're really courageous or that's really brave or whatever. And I cry, you know, because actually having that external voice like tell me that I've done well in something, and in those moments I realised, wow, I don't have that in my life, you know, because I don't have those adults in a mum or dad capacity in my life. And I did have a grandma, a maternal nan who looked after me for a time, but was very emotionally absent. And I became really aware then of how and why and what could have contributed to my mum and her journey and why she did what she did. Because there was a real lack of what felt like love. You know, she was practically loving and would cook food and so on. But it was that sort of post-Second World War generation where they didn't really talk. To talk about emotions was absolutely not, and
Yeah. I think like what I've learned recently in therapy is about emotional flashbacks. And I didn't really know much about emotional flashbacks.
Wow.
But I obviously know that like when I was triggered, I would feel things so intensely, but not knowing how that was connected to my first experience of feeling this emotion, if that makes sense.
I'm tingling because literally at the moment, I'm working through some stuff around hypervigilance as a PTSD response. And I've never been someone, they tried to diagnose me with ADHD when I was younger. And, of course, I'm sure there's lots of PTSD. But I guess I've really wanted to steer clear from the mental health.
Diagnoses,
Yeah. And actually, I feel now that I'm actually a lot more open to it because even in my ADHD traits, I recognise them now and I can see the positives but I understand that my brain developed in a certain way that makes me slightly different to the norm in terms of how I learn and how I process and how I do things. But that PTSD and the hypervigilance around when I feel insecure or I feel feelings of abandonment or sense even rejection, for me emotionally, that flashback and we have to be really honest with ourselves that is an experience that we have. I also am really working hard to not react or not allow my feelings to become facts in those moments and drive my behaviour or my actions. And I tell you, it's not easy. It's not easy.
I was telling the team last time
It
we was
ain't
here.
cute.
Yeah, I was telling the team last time we was here that I've learned this new thing from my therapist, and she's like, before we go into a situation and try and lead with our feelings, we always have to state, the story that I'm telling myself is, and give that person the opportunity to correct your feelings and the facts of the situation. And I think that that's extremely important. That's changed the way that I go into conflict or go into a situation, especially like when I'm setting boundaries or want to have difficult conversations. And I think that's, it's extremely important because we do tell ourselves stories.
I remember somebody saying once, don't let your wounds become your weapons when you're dealing with, in relationships in particular, because our wounds can lead us to fight with, the aggression and we need to stand up for ourselves and we've got our voice now and it will be heard and that can become like fight mode. And actually, if we share what I'm making this mean right now is this, and I know this may not be your intentions here, but this is how it's making me feel. And I recently heard a strapline, and I just am trying to weave it into my mind, and it's wisdom waits. And in those moments where I feel those overwhelming emotions, just really trying to take that to God and have that peace and that patience and that silence, which is so difficult for me because that little girl in me wants to stand up and kick and scream and protest and shout and let her voice be heard because it never was and fight, for what I believe is right in that moment. But often I then feel those feelings of shame afterwards when I conduct myself in that way. And I know then that actually I'm hurting myself more than I'm hurting that other person because I then carry that shame and that guilt for that behaviour.
And essentially, we're not getting the outcomes that we want when we deal with situations like that. So it is a form of like self-destruction, of self-harm, and another way for us to kind of recreate these experiences and these patterns to affirm our beliefs that maybe men are not shit. Men ain't going to show up for us. And because we've had so many experiences, either seeing it from our mums or from our own experiences going into abusive relationships, like we have the evidence that backs this up. Yeah. So sometimes it's the same thing of like looking for that narrative to affirm the story. And it's like, what are we really doing here?
Yeah.
Because we're not building a life, a healthy life that we want, essentially, that we dream about. And we all have, like we was talking about, those basic human needs. We all want to be in relationships that are healthy, that are thriving, that we're getting what we need. But the way we go about it sometimes as daddyless daughters is coming from a place of, like you said, I guess, wounds and not wisdom.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's funny you said that about looking for the evidence. That's a real trait that I have. And we call it my detective Dom shows up. And it's that when I feel triggered or insecure in some way or fear comes in, I then look for the evidence. And so the littlest thing, I will make that mean that. And that's that. And that's further evidence of that and that and that. And I'm really trying to learn to give that to God and to walk in faith. And that's what, for me, my spiritual walk, you know, it's been so important in my healing journey, because I truly understand that I cannot do this in my own strength. My mind has so many wounds and so much hurt and pain that I need something outside of myself, a higher version that I can operate from, that I can believe that I exist for, you know, as and aspire to be that version of me, as opposed to the wounded little girl that wants to act out. And I, you know, in a relationship now, in my relationship, I definitely see that there are times where, you know, we bring out that little girl and little boy version of each other in arguments, and it's not nice, it's not pretty, and it's not, you know, both of us, me and my partner, are very intentional about having a healthy relationship. And sometimes that is so hard because we both have wounds that we're working through, and we can really trigger each other sometimes. And it's being able to come back to that place and take that personal responsibility. And as I was saying to you earlier as well, you know, I'm getting really brave in setting boundaries and being able to articulate, well, this really doesn't work for me. And that's really courageous, because my biggest fear is abandonment and rejection. It's that you're going to leave or you're going to cheat. And I have been so scared to do anything that might contribute to that outcome that I've not allowed my voice to be heard or articulated at times. And I'm going through a season at the moment where I'm being super bold in saying and really fiercely loving myself by saying, this is not going to work for me. And I have had to detach myself from the outcome of what that other person might do as a result. And we were talking about it earlier, the difference between attachment and connection. And attachment trauma is what I struggle with. You know, when I look back on they say our first 2 years of life are our most pivotal in terms of shaping our behaviours and our thoughts, and particularly how we then show up in relationships as adults. And obviously learning that, you know, I'd lost that relationship with my dad at 6 months old, and my mum emotionally was very absent because of what she was going through. So although she was there, she wasn't able to emotionally care for me. And understanding then that has shown up in so many ways that has been really painful, you know.
And I guess it's also like reframing what that vulnerability, what our understanding of vulnerability is. Because like we were saying earlier, like, you know, if we have all of this evidence throughout of our life that when I show up vulnerable, people exploit me or people take the mick out of the situation or whatever, our understanding of what it means to show up vulnerable then gets, do you know what I'm saying? It becomes conflicting. So now it's about you also reshaping what vulnerability means to you and being able to show up in a vulnerable state, but trusting that the man that you've chosen to be with is going to be able to affirm you in that moment. So let's get into relationships.
Ooh,
after
let's not.
After all your teenage
let's
years.
Let's just stay away from them for all
girl,
of our life.
No, we're getting into it. After all of this stuff has kind of happened now, how did you start to kind of, what did your relationships look like with men?
So throughout my 20s, they were just very emotionally chaotic. You know, I was, none of them were violent as such. Although I remember one of my first relationships, like 15, 16 years old, getting a pair of hair straighteners. You know those Daddyless Steam and Shine ones that you get, you filled up the little water bit and stuck it on the end. I remember bashing one, using that to bash someone over the head. Okay, that was my only violent outburst. But outside of that, it's just been that desperation to be heard and to feel like that person loves me. And my theme song is that Luther Vandross, Never Too Much. Never too much, because I just can't get enough. Like, you could affirm me all day long and love on me and be affectionate, but it's never enough for me. And I've had to learn that about myself as well, because even in my current relationship, my partner's very affectionate and he's very affirming. And I'm talking every day, and it's still sometimes not enough. And on the days where he hasn't, I start to go, he hasn't told me he loves me today. He hasn't told me that I'm beautiful. He hasn't said, and it already, it's like this stuff plays out. So I'm learning to really make sure that I'm affirming myself every day. And because unless we go inside, we will never get that external validation enough. You know, it has to come from inside of us. But so many of my relationships, I just remember this one instance with a partner, and this was pretty reflective of most of the relationships I was in throughout my 20s. But I remember shouting at him and him just being sat on the sofa, just looking at me. And I threw a cushion at him. And I just remember, and I was screaming, you know, I was really going for it. And it was just shut down, like absolutely nothing from him. And the reality was, because of who I was, and I was so unhealed, and I was so toxic in my own behaviours and my need to be loved, you know, and the neediness that exuded from me. I think I never went through healthy processes of dating, of getting to know someone. I would rush into relationships very quickly and move in with them within a month, you know, really tragic stuff. And then, you know, be like, well, where's all the love? Like, where's all the love? And I would constantly try and fix men. And what I've learned is that we attract very much who we are, you know, and not just who we are, but our intention. And my intention was to have love, to be loved. My intention now is to love myself and then to love others from that place. So I've attracted a very different type of person because of that. But throughout and I then went through a season of singleness for about 7 years whilst I started doing this work on myself. And to be honest, I probably stayed single for too long. I look back on it and I think, I should have gone on some dates and, you know, explored a little bit at that point. But, you know, that was what I believe, that was the journey God took me on. You know, it was after I came to faith and really started to go on that internal journey of who am I, you know, understanding that I belonged, that I'm loved, that I'm enough, that I'm worthy, with or without that external person.
What was your breaking point?
I was in a relationship with somebody that was heavily in addiction, and I'm talking class A drugs addiction. And actually on the surface, and it's so interesting because probably very similar to myself, on the surface presented as very successful. You know, they were an author, a very influential speaker, quite well known, had published work, etc. But behind the scenes, the behaviours were wonky, very wonky. And within a month, he had relapsed on class A drugs. And I decided that actually, instead of leaving him, what I should do is get a house and we should live there together, because that would give him some stability and some security. And I look back on that now and I just feel so sorry for that little girl inside of me that so desperately wanted to be loved, that I had no boundaries. I didn't understand that word. In fact, I remember exploring what boundaries are and, you know, really rejecting that word because it felt so cold. But that was the breaking point. We were living together. I think we'd been together about 4 months and there'd been a lot of chaos in our relationship. And he had disappeared, relapsed again for like the third time, not come home for a couple of nights. And I remember, I think I looked up online and found this helpline or this group which talked about their experiences of being with somebody that was in active addiction and what that looked like for them. And I just remember being like, I don't want that. I do not want that for my life. And that morning I'd woken up crying and really hysterical, and I looked at myself and I saw myself in the mirror, and I saw this girl looking back at me that I did not recognize. And that was enough for me to go, I need to take my power back. And I rang a friend of mine at the time, and she said to me, Dominy, whatever you do, get to church, go to church today. And I think it must have been a Sunday. And I went to church and I had this incredible spiritual experience. And I really believe I was changed from the inside that day. And then there was a process of working that out and walking that out and what that looked like. And that process took many years and still continues. But that for me was, I would say, the pivotal point of transition and change. Certainly in taking back my power and taking that personal responsibility, you know, and really saying, right, what can I do differently here?
Obviously the concept is like dirty water, right? And I remember like one of my breaking points was kind of, I had a mirror moment as well. That's what I like to call them, mirror moments. And what I saw looking back at me was my mum.
Wow.
And because I was so fixated when I was growing up on not becoming this woman, and I built up a lot of resentment for the type of situations that she found herself in. Obviously, I was very ignorant. I didn't understand that she didn't even have the tools, and how she grew. She was figuring out her own trauma as well. But because I was so fixated on not becoming that, but then I recreated that. And when I had that mirror moment, and I saw her looking back at me, that's when I was like, okay, this is when where I draw the line, type of thing. Did you have any sort of moments where you realized I'm repeating patterns that I resented from my childhood?
Yeah. Well, that exact one. I mean, that's so interesting to hear you say you saw your mum, because similarly, there's been times along the way where I have realised that. So my mum had 5 children from 4 different men, and I look at that pattern and I think, well, that was a desperate seeking for love. You know, to be loved by the man, but then possibly the child as well. You know, to feel loved. And I 100% can relate to that in terms of some of my earlier experiences of relationships and what I was seeking out. And I guess you come to a point where you really understand as well, like, a relationship is not ever going to make you feel loved. In fact, actually, it's the opposite. You know, I read something recently that our relationships are like classrooms, not candy shops. You know, and and it's true.
I came across a similar quote years ago, and it really resonated with me. And it was saying something around the lines of like, we should use relationships as mirrors that are going to show us the things in ourselves that we need to work on.
This is it. Absolutely. Absolutely. Because, you know, we see, looking back at us, that reflection of ourselves, whether that's good or whether that's bad. And so, and also, I think for me, romantic relationships, and this isn't the same for everyone, you know, some people's triggers will be friendships or family relationships. But I've really identified that for me, my romantic relationship, and chemically speaking and scientifically speaking, neuroscience shows us that there is this attachment piece that we form in our really intimate relationships.
And it's very similar to people who are who struggle with addiction.
Yes, in terms of the chemicals, exactly. And this attachment that we have with this person, it's so easy to play out the resentments and the wounds from our childhood, because we start to project our needs and expect that this person's going to now meet the needs that our parents never did. And I guess the most powerful part in my healing journey has been understanding that only I can meet those needs, and only I am the only one responsible for meeting those needs, actually. And between me and God, if I don't do that in the morning, I go into my day and my behaviours are wonky. Like, I am off kilter, I'm off balanced, I'm insecure, I'm anxious, I'm all of those things. So for me, those morning practices, I absolutely have to do them, because that's my recovery. In the same way that, you know, for people that have been in addiction or are familiar with the 12 steps, for me, those are spiritual principles by which we should all live our lives, not holding on to resentments, being really clear that we cannot control the outcomes of situations. We have to surrender to a higher power, etc. So for me, my recovery journey is just as important, because I can relapse emotionally if I'm not filling myself up and I'm not giving myself what I need in terms of those affirmations and, reminding myself that I am worthy and I am enough, and having evidence, finding evidence for that, as opposed to, detective dominant. But actually doing that.
Yeah. Another pattern that I've kind of noticed with us daddyless daughters is we're very much attracted to motherless sons. And creating that trauma bond and trying to, like you were saying, the needs, innit? Us trying to fulfill their needs that they didn't get from their mums, and hoping that they would show up and try and fulfill our needs that we didn't necessarily get from our dads, whether we're consciously aware of it or not. Did you repeatedly trauma bond and recreate those patterns?
Aliyah, absolutely. And we spoke about this. I think we did an Insta Live specifically on trauma bonds, didn't we? Because we just really resonated on that topic at that time in our life as well, I think. Absolutely. And to some extent, I have to be honest now in that probably is still the truth. Although I would say I would no longer, it wouldn't be acceptable to me now to be with somebody that wasn't actively doing their work on themselves as well. Because let's be honest, none of us have had perfect parents, even if we've had mum and dad at home, right? That we've all had experiences of some level of trauma. And I truly believe that, we never know what someone else is walking through. And many of us walk through difficulty in life. Undoubtedly, pain is always going to come. Do we want to stay in the suffering? That's the question for all of us. So I think the trauma bond is always very real, and in terms of who we're attracted to and what attracts us and what feels exciting and whatever. But I think being really aware of it and really intentional about how, what are healthy behaviors and also what strategies do we have, because I know that these wounds are within me. They're never not going to be part of who I am. I have to take responsibility for that. I also have to recognize that the person that I am going to be in a relationship with, there's certain qualities and compatibility needs and so on that are going to contribute to me feeling more anxious or feeling more secure in that relationship. And that process of working that out has been really pivotal in my relationship now.
So what does this work look like? For anybody who hasn't started
the journey, Lord, lots of money on therapy.
And that's another thing that we need to actually talk about as well, because, a lot of girls who have kind of grown up like us and had certain backgrounds never kind of financially get out of survival mode as well. We talk a lot about emotional needs and relationships and all of those things, but financially as well, there's statistics that back up that daddyless daughters, we're going to live in poverty for the majority of our lives. So a lot of women can't access therapy that are maybe dealing with these type of issues. So other than therapy, any girl that or woman who can actually really resonate with the things that you're saying, what would you suggest that they could do to kind of start the journey that wouldn't cost money?
Listen to your podcast. Listen to my podcast. I think we're so fortunate now to have so much available to us, and I've always loved reading. I've been really lucky. Reading was an escape for me, even as a little girl. And so I remember reading Enid Blyton and whatever. But for many years now, non-fiction books I just can't get enough of. So reading, studying, YouTube, podcasts, surrounding yourself with people that you want to be like, people that inspire you, empower you, and that you aspire to be like, I think is a pivotal one. For me, my faith has played a huge part, understanding that there is a higher purpose to me being in this world, and it's more than just me and my little self. Like that actually there's a greater purpose to the pain that I've experienced, that I can use my story to positively impact, empower and inspire other women and girls. I mean, that's an incredible gift. Like that I truly feel very privileged and honoured to be able to do that and get to do that quite naturally, like yourself, like because we've walked this road and we are actively doing the work and becoming conscious about our behaviour and taking responsibility. I mean, I think fundamentally doing the work looks like taking responsibility for ourselves every single day, you know, reparenting ourselves. Like, we've talked about this before, but for me, it really started in the practical things. Like, again, in early therapy, it was like, okay, what are your routines? You know, how much do you sleep? What do you eat? What do you feed yourself? Like, I was running about all the time, yes, yes, yes to everyone, being everyone's helper. I wasn't prioritizing myself and my needs and cooking for myself, doing a food shop, like planning my schedule, exercise. I mean, you know, for me, my fitness has been a huge part of my transformational journey in recent years, you know.
That was something I wanted to mention to you earlier, but actually, speaking about fitness, how has your body kept the score? Because, you know, I love that book.
We love that book, yeah.
And also, there was something that you said earlier, but what I'd noticed in terms of, it's the affirmations, right? When people pour in love and what you need, what you maybe lacked in the childhood into you, my body rejects it. For a long time, I would get tense. I didn't like it. I didn't like people to really try and deposit love into me. I didn't respond to it. And I really realized that was my body keeping the score of a lot of my experiences. And a lot of it is now kind of rewiring my body, my relationship with my body, and trying to relax and be more open to healthy relationships, really. So how's your body kept the score?
That is such a great, like, insight. Because it's funny, I remember, like, I never related to the idea of health. Like, I just completely rejected that as an identity, like as somebody that was healthy or went to the gym or ran, or like I just couldn't connect with it. And I believe it was such a poverty mentality and mindset that I'd come from, you know. And they say that often that your mum's relationship with her body in the most subtle ways from when we're in the womb has such an incredible impact on us as women and how we relate to our body and how we look after ourselves and perceive ourselves. But you know, I smoked from a very young age. Obviously, I spoke about some of the drugs and things like that. And I guess I was completely separated from my body, you know. And now spiritually, I know that my body is a shell, but it's a shell that's going to take me through this life and enable me to have impact. And that is my highest, you know, purpose in this world. And so I've learned to really love my body and love feeling strong. So like getting into the gym and exercising, and that whole process for me was so transformative because it was never about how I physically looked. I was never somebody that really you know, I was a much bigger girl at one stage. I think you've seen my transformation pictures. I dropped 3 dress sizes, which is really significant, but over 4 years, because for me, it was never, I need to lose weight or I want to look like this or whatever. It was purely, I was in therapy and I was doing this work emotionally, and it was from the inside out that I started to want to love myself and look after myself and exercise and go to the gym and stop smoking and start running and start eating well. And bit by bit, and don't get it twisted, and I say this to everyone, there was no magic wand that overnight I radically became, you know, I ran a half marathon last year, and it was like this amazing milestone in my life because I remember my first run, Aliyah, not that long ago, 3-4 years ago. It was, I walked to the local park, I ran for 2 minutes, and then I stopped and walked home. And then I did it again the next day, but for like 3 minutes, and then the following day. And it really has been a compound effect of healthy habits and exchanging that unhealthy choice for this healthier choice. And not always, you know, I still battle with the smoking, I still battle with eating this and that and whatever, but broadly speaking, the majority of my choices now are so much healthier, and I'm very committed to my training and my exercise. And I love, going into the gym and lifting weights is something I've got into, I'd say, in the last year or so. And again, like the mental strength that I get from doing that, and the power that I've seen that I have, the way that my body's transformed physically has given me so much more confidence about how I can continue to transform, not just physically, but mentally, emotionally, spiritually, financially. That actually this is a physical manifestation of the changes that I can take responsibility for, that I can actually do, because we all can do that. We all can be that version of ourselves that we want to be. And I've got, pages and pages of visualizations, and I want to be this healthiest version of me, et cetera, et cetera. And genuinely speaking, that's what's happened. I've started to really manifest that now. But it really is like there was no one day where I woke up and was like, right, today I'm motivated and I'm going to run and I'm going to go to the gym and I'm going to eat well. And no, it's been a very slow process,
And a repetitive, is that the word?
Repetitive, yeah.
Repetitive process as
Consistency.
Yeah.
Ooh, I learned the meaning of that word. Consistency.
It's difficult though, because I think at the beginning of my journey, it was like I would set these high expectations, the same pattern I would do in relationships, set these high expectations for myself and just collect more evidence as to why I'm going to fail in life. Or because I just couldn't consistently show up for myself. Do you get what I'm saying?
Right.
So like I would 100% say, okay, yeah, I'm going to go and run. And instead of like taking small steps, like what you did, just show up. Like even if you're just walking for 2 minutes or 5 minutes or whatever, in your brain, you are rewiring yourself. And all you have to really do is show up to kind of make that habit a blueprint in your mind. But I would set these high expectations and go in full throttle, like all in, and then fail. And then I stayed in that pattern for about like 2.5 years. And that also was self-destructive. And another cycle of, I was just collecting evidence as to why I can't do it. And now I'm a lot more focused on acceptance and surrender and those small steps and just showing up repetitively, like you said.
Brilliant. It's so important. And it's that compassion and that grace for ourselves, 100%. And not allowing our feelings to dictate our behaviours and our actions as well, because there were so many mornings, and there still are, where I do not feel like it. I do not. And, Mel Robbins has this thing where she says 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, go. And it's this idea that you don't negotiate in your head like, oh, well, I won't get up now and I'll do that. No, it's the preparation. The night before, my gym stuff is there. It's what I'm putting on first thing in the morning. There's no negotiation. What am I going to wear? Oh, I've got to find this. It's there. It's ready to go. So I remember watching something about willpower, and it talked about, there's no such thing. It is simply the elimination. Is that the right word? Eliminating the choices to not do it. So if my kit is out and ready to go, I've got rid of a choice to have to find it or whatever, And for me, that's been really powerful, not allowing my feelings to dictate what I do, but holding on to how I know I'm going to feel after I've exercised, that release of endorphins, that high, that, that power that I feel, that like, yeah, I've done something for me, just for me. No one else can control it. I've done that.
So where are you at now?
Wow, I'm sat in this room with you. So life is good.
You definitely survived. You made it.
Yeah. Just so now I feel really honoured to be in the place that I am, where I get to speak into the lives of other women. As you know, I'm involved quite significantly in an organisation that I co-founded, which we work with young people, primarily those that have been excluded from mainstream and have been in the care system or the criminal justice system. But my real aspirations, and over the next couple of years, I really, something that I've also seen massive transformation in is my finances. And again, an area that I really took responsibility for, and have got into property and very fortunate to own a few properties now, and to be in a position where I'm building wealth. And I talk about that not from a superficial perspective, but from, I want to leave a legacy which is the opposite of poverty, which is wealth in all aspects, physical,
It's mindset as
spiritual,
well.
emotional, mental, exactly. And so over the next year or so, I'm feeling very challenged in that area, but to really step out and really run my own business with regards to the coaching work that I do with women and run online coaching programs, launch that, like really get courageous with what I know I'm called to do. And then I have all these other ideas of like merchandise and books and all this lovely stuff. But primarily I know I'm called to impact the lives of women that have experienced trauma and that have experienced a difficult start to life. But those women that are refusing to quit, are refusing to give up, are refusing to accept that is where they stay. Because I know for me, the growth is exponential and it's just going to keep on coming. And the best is yet to come.
Yeah, it definitely is. And if any of those women are watching right now, where can they find you?
Best place is my Insta. So at Dominy Rowe on Insta, DOMINYROE. And I also have Love Dominy, which is where I share a lot of my kind of healing stuff, and the Path to Power podcast. I've done 2 seasons and I'm hoping to launch season 3 later this year. And again, consistency, because I've struggled in the area of consistency with stepping out and being courageous in my business. And that's, for me now, the new challenge is doing that this year. But yeah, so guys, you can hold me to account.
I definitely will be. Well, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
I think people are going to take away some great stuff from this conversation, and I hope it really does help both your audience and mine to continue the journey. And understand that, it is a journey. There's no end destination. And they're not alone, I guess.
And I just want to honour you in the work that you do as well in this space, because it's not easy, is it? And it takes a lot of us to come out and to give over our story and to speak into the lives of others and share so much of us, and become so vulnerable and transparent. And I'm really proud of you, sis. And I'm really honoured to get to walk this road with you.
You too, man. I can't wait to see what we're going to make happen.
Amen. Woo.
Well, thank you guys for watching. The end.
The end.
After my dad left, the idea of a relationship that I saw was toxicity. It was a domestic abuse situation, constantly calling police for her and stuff. So it was more of a go with the flow and let's just see how this plans out. I don't think I was mature enough mentally to know how it would be or know how hard it would be.
Right.
It was after I had the child, I now realised that this is not a joke. But I just wanted to make her happy so she gets off my back and I'll stop being the disappointment child